Imagine for a second, right, that you are a highly respected priest. I mean, your entire life, your identity, your career trajectory, it's all tied to this beautiful, gleaming temple right in the center of your civilization.
Yet your whole world.
Exactly. But then, I mean, the unthinkable happens. The city is besieged. You get dragged hundreds of miles away into a completely foreign, deeply hostile empire.
Which is traumatic enough on its own.
Right. And then instead of serving in this glorious holy place, the voice of the divine tells you to go outside, gather human dung, bake your daily bread over it, and just eat it while lying perfectly still on your side for over a year.
Yeah, it's wild. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today we're jumping into the world of Ezekiel.
We really are. And it's arguably the most visceral, shocking, and just sensory overloading book in the entire biblical canon.
Oh, absolutely. It really is.
Yeah. And look, we know you're here because you want to get past those surface level, Sunday school versions of these ancient texts. You want the mechanics, the historical grit, the underlying architecture of these ideas.
Yeah, you want to see how the engine actually works.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive today is to unpack this incredibly dense, fascinating academic paper. It's titled The Gospel According to Ezekiel, a redemptive historical analysis of judgment, regeneration, and restoration.
And right out of the gate, that title, I mean, it feels like a total contradiction.
It totally does. Because when anyone who knows even a little bit about the Bible hears the name Ezekiel, your mind does not go straight to the gospel. Or, good news.
No, not at all. You think of the bizarre stuff.
Right. You think of hallucinogenic visions of, wheels covered in eyeballs.
Yeah, and the terrifying apocalyptic judgments. You think of a man who is essentially forced to become this living, breathing performance art piece of divine wrath.
Yeah, exactly. It does not scream comforting bedside reading.
No, but, and this is the interesting part, the core thesis of this source text argues the exact opposite.
Right.
The author makes this really compelling case that Ezekiel actually serves as a massive, intricate, redemptive historical blueprint for the entire New Testament.
Which is a huge claim. The paper uses this specific theological term, proto-evangelium.
Yeah, proto-evangelium,
Yeah.
which is just a Latin term that essentially means the first gospel, or, a foreshadowing of the gospel.
Okay, so how does the doom and gloom foreshadow the good news?
Well, the fundamental premise of the paper is that Ezekiel is laying down the absolute prerequisite for true, lasting hope. And that prerequisite, surprisingly, is complete demolition.
Wow, complete demolition. I mean, you can't just slap a fresh coat of paint on a rotting house.
Precisely. We naturally want renovation.
Yeah.
Right? We want a gospel that just comes into our lives, keeps the foundation totally intact, and maybe just makes things a little nicer.
Or fixes the plumbing, maybe.
Right, exactly. But the gospel, according to Ezekiel, argues that true hope can only be built on the far side of utter destruction. The false securities have to be leveled to the dirt before anything real can be constructed.
Okay, so to really grasp the sheer scale of that demolition, we have to travel back in time a bit. We need to go back to the 6th century BC.
Yeah, specifically to the banks of the Ichabod Canal in Babylon.
Right. We have to sit in the dirt with these people. Because you really can't understand the medicine Ezekiel is prescribing until you understand the absolute catastrophe of the disease.
The historical context here isn't just, background information. It's the entire engine of the book.
So set the scene for us. What are we looking at?
We're talking about the period leading up to and immediately following 586 BC. This is the year Jerusalem falls to the Babylonian Empire.
Under King Nebuchadnezzar, right?
Exactly.
Nebuchadnezzar. So let's paint a picture for you of what that actually looked like. Because we hear a phrase like, the city fell, and it sounds so clean, so historical.
Yeah, very sterile.
Right. But this was a brutal multi-year siege. The Babylonians completely surrounded Jerusalem. They cut off the food supply.
The historical accounts are horrifying. If you read the Book of Lamentations, it describes conditions inside the city that are just unspeakable.
Like starvation to the point of cannibalism.
Yeah. Disease, total societal collapse. It was an absolute nightmare.
And then eventually the walls are breached, the city is burned to the ground, and the survivors are death marched across the desert to Babylon.
And here's the thing. That physical devastation, that was actually secondary to the theological devastation.
Really? How so?
Because what died in 586 BC wasn't just a city. It was an entire worldview. The source text spends a lot of time analyzing the collapse of something called Zion theology.
Okay, Zion theology. Break that down for us. What exactly is that, and why was it so dangerous?
Well, Zion theology was this deeply entrenched, heavily nationalistic belief system. It was rooted in the idea that because Yahweh's physical temple was located in Jerusalem, specifically on Mount Zion, the city was eternally bulletproof.
Ah, so like a divine shield.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They looked back at their history, at the promises God made to King David, and they twisted them into this, like, lucky rabbit's foot.
So what was the prevailing attitude then?
The prevailing thought was basically, God lives in that golden box in the Holy of Holies. God will never allow his own house to be destroyed.
Right.
Therefore, we can live however we want, we can commit injustice, we can worship other gods on the side, and we will always be safe because, hey, we have the temple.
It's the ultimate trump card. You can't touch us, God lives here.
Yeah, precisely.
I was actually thinking about how to frame this for you, the listener, and it's
Yeah.
basically like being the captain of the Titanic.
Oh, I like this. Go on.
The entire marketing campaign of your civilization is that this ship is unsinkable. That's your Zion theology.
Right.
But then not only do you hit an iceberg, but you realize the architect of the ship actually steered it into the iceberg on purpose. And now you, as the captain, that's Ezekiel, you're sitting in a lifeboat surrounded by traumatized survivors, and your job is to convince them that the unsinkable ship actually had to sink.
That is a phenomenal analogy. It really captures the sheer psychological impossibility of Ezekiel's task.
Just he's a priest, right?
Yes, his entire lineage, his training since he was a kid, all of it was preparing him to serve in that very temple.
But he never gets to.
No. He's taken in the first wave of exiles, a few years before the final destruction of the city, so he finds himself in a refugee camp in Babylon.
Surrounded by people who are probably still clinging desperately to the hope that God is going to magically save Jerusalem at the last minute.
Exactly. They're thinking, God won't let it fall. Any day now, we're going home.
So his job description is just awful. The paper categorizes his work into a dual ministry, the ministry of killing and making alive.
Yeah, and the killing part comes first. The first 32 chapters of the book are the ministry of demolition.
32 chapters of just tearing things down.
Yes. Ezekiel's sole purpose for years is to look these desperate refugees in the eye and say, Jerusalem is going to burn. The temple is going to be reduced to rubble.
Oh.
And worst of all, it's not because the Babylonian gods are stronger than Yahweh, it's because Yahweh himself is orchestrating the destruction as a righteous judgment against your covenant breaking.
Talk about a tough pill to swallow. He is relentlessly stripping away that Zion theology. Every time they try to find a sliver of false hope, he just takes a sledgehammer to it.
He really does.
And what fascinates me, actually, is the title God uses for Ezekiel while he's swinging this sledgehammer. Throughout the book, God addresses him over 90 times as Son of Man.
Yes.
In Hebrew, the phrase is Ben Adam.
This is such a crucial linguistic detail because when we hear the phrase Son of Man, our modern New Testament wired brains immediately think of Jesus.
Right. We think it's a divine title, like a messianic claim.
Exactly. But in Ezekiel's context, Ben Adam means the exact opposite of that.
Because it literally means son of earth or son of dirt, right? Like Adam comes from Adama, which means the ground.
You've got it. God is constantly reminding Ezekiel of his infinite frailty.
So it's almost an insult.
More of a reality check.
Yeah.
Every time God says, Son of Man, prophesy, he is basically saying, you mere mortal, you creature of dust, speak for the infinite creator.
Wow.
It emphasizes the massive, unbridgeable qualitative distance between the holy God and a sinful, fragile human.
And you really see that frailty in how Ezekiel is treated throughout the book. I mean, he isn't just preaching sermons from a pulpit. He is physically absorbing the trauma of the judgment.
Yes, his body becomes the message.
God makes him physically mute for long stretches. He binds him with ropes.
And the cooking over the dung that we mentioned earlier,
Yeah, what was the point of that?
that was to symbolize the unclean, desperate rations the people would be forced to eat during the siege of Jerusalem. He is acting out the horror in real time.
But wait, if Ben Adam just means creature of dust, how on earth does that become the cosmic divine title that Jesus uses for himself in the Gospels?
Okay, to understand that, we actually have to look slightly forward to another prophet. We have to look at the book of Daniel.
Which was also written during the same exile, right?
Exactly, same general time period. Now, in Daniel chapter 7, there is this incredible vision of a divine figure riding on the clouds of heaven, and he is sharing the glory of the Ancient of Days, which is God.
Okay.
But because Daniel is largely written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, the phrase used there is Bar Enosh.
Bar Enosh.
Right. It also translates to Son of Man in English, but it carries this immense weight of divine cosmic authority. It's a heavenly figure.
Ah, I see. So you basically have two distinct streams of thought for that phrase. You have the Ezekiel stream, the frail, suffering human son of man who's acting out judgment in the dirt.
Yeah.
And then you have the Daniel stream, the divine, authoritative son of man riding the clouds.
And here is the sheer theological genius of the Incarnation. When Jesus arrives in the New Testament and starts calling himself the Son of Man, he is deliberately fusing those two streams together.
Oh, wow. That's brilliant.
Right. He is the divine authoritative figure from Daniel, who possesses all judgment. But he is also the frail, suffering figure from Ezekiel who will actually bear that judgment in his own physical body.
So Jesus bridges the gap that Ezekiel was only allowed to point toward.
Exactly. Jesus is the ultimate Ben Adam and Bar Enosh all at once.
That is incredible. The God who spoke to the dust in Babylon actually becomes the dust in the New Testament.
Beautifully put.
But, okay, let's stay in Babylon for a moment. Because once Ezekiel successfully smashes that Zion theology, a massive theological vacuum opens up for the exiles.
A terrifying vacuum.
Right, because if God's presence is tied to the physical temple, and Ezekiel is promising that the physical temple is going to be destroyed, where does that leave the exiles? Are they just cut off from God completely?
That is the exact terror they were facing. You have to remember how religion worked in the ancient Near East. Deities were hyper-territorial.
Like they had zip codes.
Exactly. If you were a Moabite, your god was Chemosh, and Chemosh only had power in Moab. If you got conquered and dragged to Babylon, well, the Babylonian god Marduk was clearly stronger.
And Chemosh couldn't help you outside his border?
Right. So the Israelites in exile were terrified. They thought either Yahweh was too weak to stop Marduk, or that Yahweh was geographically stuck in the rubble of Jerusalem.
Which makes the very first chapter of Ezekiel arguably the most explosive paradigm shift in ancient religion.
It shatters all their categories.
Ezekiel is standing by the canal in Babylon, the heavens open, and he sees this thing. We often call it the Merkabah, the chariot.
Yes. And it is a total sensory overload.
Walk us through what he actually sees.
He sees a massive storm cloud coming from the north, flashing with fire. And out of the fire come 4 terrifying living creatures. Each one has 4 faces. A human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle.
Sounds like a fever dream.
It does. And beside each creature is a massive gleaming wheel intersecting another wheel. And the rims of these wheels are covered entirely with eyes.
Creepy.
Very. And above all this is a crystal expanse. And on top of that expanse is a throne made of lapis lazuli. And seated on the throne is a figure glowing like hot metal.
I mean, it sounds like science fiction. It sounds like a literal alien spacecraft landing.
It really does to a modern reader.
But you have to strip away our modern sci-fi lens, right? You have to look at what this meant to an ancient Israelite. What is the actual mechanism of this vision? Like, why the wheels? Why the eyes?
Every single bizarre detail is a precise theological counterattack against their fears. Let's start with the wheels.
Okay.
In the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple, God's presence rested on the Ark of the Covenant, which was flanked by 2 static golden cherubim.
It was essentially a stationary throne.
Exactly, it didn't move. But Ezekiel is seeing a throne with wheels.
Yeah.
It is a mobile command center. God is not geographically locked to a piece of real estate in the Middle East. He is a sovereign king who can ride his throne chariot straight into the heart of the Babylonian Empire, right into the unclean dirt of the refugee camp.
He is untethered from the building. That is huge. And what about the eyes? You mentioned the rims of the wheels are full of eyes.
That represents absolute omniscience.
Because the exiles felt unseen,
Right.
forgotten by God.
Yes. The eyes declare that God sees everything. He sees the secret plotting happening back in Jerusalem, and he sees the silent tears of the captives in Babylon. Nothing escapes his notice.
And the 4 faces on the creatures.
They represent sovereignty over all domains of creation. The lion for wild beasts, the ox for domesticated animals, the eagle for birds, and the human for humanity.
So, on one level, this vision is incredibly comforting. God is here. He doesn't trapped in Jerusalem. He sees us.
Yes.
But, and this is a big but, I have a massive problem with this.
What's the problem?
If God is this insanely powerful, mobile, omniscient, sovereign king, why are his people sitting by a canal in Babylon in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. If he can ride a flaming chariot into Nebuchadnezzar's backyard, why didn't he just obliterate the Babylonian army when they first showed up at the walls of Jerusalem?
That is the most natural human pushback possible. And the source paper points out that Ezekiel doesn't flinch from that question. He tackles it head on.
How so?
Well, if the Merkabah vision in chapter 1 is the doctor arriving in the waiting room with an MRI machine, chapter 16 of Ezekiel is the doctor slapping the scan results up on the whiteboard.
And I'm guessing the diagnosis isn't good?
It is utterly devastating. It is arguably the bleakest, most horrific view of human nature in the entire biblical text.
Yeah, the imagery he uses here is genuinely hard to even read out loud. I mean, other prophets like Jeremiah, they'll occasionally look back at Israel's early history and speak of a honeymoon period.
Right, like remember when we were in the wilderness and things were good and we loved each other?
Yeah. But Ezekiel gives no quarter. He basically says there was never a honeymoon.
He uses this powerful allegory of an abandoned infant. And to really get the horror of this, you have to understand ancient birthing practices.
Okay, lay it out for us.
In the ancient world, when a baby was born, the umbilical cord was cut, the child was washed with water, rubbed with salt for hygiene, and wrapped tightly in swaddling clothes.
Basic ancient neonatal care.
Right. But Ezekiel says to Israel, when you were born, your cord was not cut. You were not washed, you were not salted, you were not swaddled.
Wow.
You were thrown out into an open field to die,
Mhm.
completely unwanted, wallowing in your own birth blood.
It's the ultimate picture of absolute helplessness. The infant has no merit, no beauty, no potential, and no ability to save itself whatsoever.
None. And then God walks by.
And what happened?
The text says God walks by and sees this bloody, dying infant, and he simply speaks one word over it. He says, Lev.
I said to you in your blood, Lev.
Yes. And that one single word is the purest distillation of what theologians call monergistic salvation.
Monergistic. Okay, let's unpack that jargon for a second.
Sure. Mono meaning one, ergon meaning work.
So it means a salvation wrought by the work of one party.
Exactly. The infant didn't reach up and ask for help. The infant didn't, promise to be a really good baby if God saved it.
The infant was fundamentally incapable of doing anything but dying.
God initiates the salvation entirely on his own, driven purely by his own unmerited grace. He washes the child, clothes her in fine linen, and eventually, in the allegory, he marries her. He elevates her to the status of a queen.
It's a beautiful picture, but then the tragedy of the human condition kicks in.
It always does.
She grows up, she realizes she is beautiful, completely forgetting that God gave her that beauty, by the way. And the text says she trusts in her own beauty and plays the harlot.
Yes, she prostitutes herself with every passing nation.
She forms political alliances with Egypt and Assyria. She adopts their gods. She even goes so far as to sacrifice her own children to these false idols.
Which, from Ezekiel's perspective, completely shifts the blame for the exile.
Right, because the exiles are sitting in Babylon asking, why did God fail us?
And Ezekiel says, God didn't fail you. You failed the covenant so spectacularly and so repeatedly that a perfectly just God had no choice but to execute the curses of that covenant.
The problem isn't external. It's not that Babylon was too strong. The problem is internal. It's what Ezekiel later diagnoses as a heart of stone.
Exactly, a heart of stone. Think about a stone. It's dead, cold, and entirely unresponsive to external stimuli.
You can yell at a stone, you can read the Ten Commandments to a stone, you can put a stone in the Holy of Holies, and it will remain a stone.
The tragedy of Israel's history is that God gave them the best laws, the best land, and the best temple, but it was all external. Their internal nature was fundamentally calcified.
Which brings us to a really terrifying moment in the book. If the people have literal hearts of stone and they're committing these horrific acts of idolatry right inside the physical temple in Jerusalem, what happens to the presence of God?
Right. What happens to that static glory sitting between the cherubim?
Yeah. This brings us to chapters 8 through 11, the vision of the departure, the concept of Ichabod.
Ichabod, which translates to the glory has departed.
How does that happen in the text?
God essentially takes Ezekiel on a virtual tour of the Jerusalem temple before it falls. And Ezekiel sees the absolute corruption. He sees the elders of Israel secretly burning incense to idols of creeping things painted on the walls.
In secret rooms.
Yes. He sees women weeping for Tammuz, a Babylonian fertility god. He sees men standing in the inner court with their backs to the sanctuary of Yahweh, bowing down to worship the sun.
Right. In God's living room. The disrespect is staggering.
It really is. And in response, the Merkabah, that mobile throne-chariot from chapter 1, arrives at the temple, and we witness this agonizing slow-motion withdrawal of the divine presence.
It's step by step, right?
Yes.
Yes.
The glory of God rises from the Ark of the Covenant. It moves to the threshold of the temple.
Right.
Then it moves to the east gate. Then it hovers over the Mount of Olives, and finally it ascends and leaves the city completely.
Okay, I have to stop you here, because this feels like a massive contradiction to the whole idea of this book being a gospel or good news.
I can see why you'd say that.
I mean, the doctor looked at the scan, saw the heart of stone, and instead of operating, he just packed his bags and left the hospital. Leaving these people to get slaughtered by the Babylonian army does not feel like grace. It feels like ultimate abandonment.
I completely understand why it feels that way. But the source text argues that this departure is actually a profound paradox. It is an act of surgical grace wrapped in judgment.
Surgical grace. Explain that.
To understand why, you have to remember the fire and lightning surrounding the throne in chapter 1. God is infinitely blazing holy.
Right. Holiness isn't just moral perfection. In the Old Testament, it's a dangerous, consuming energy to anything that is impure.
Exactly. Think of it like a nuclear reactor. If the containment field is compromised, the radiation will incinerate everything around it.
Okay.
God's presence in the temple was maintained by the complex containment field of the Levitical sacrifices in the priesthood. But the people had completely shattered that containment field with their idolatry.
So the radiation is leaking out.
If a perfectly holy God remained inside a city entirely saturated with unrepentant sin, the resulting reaction wouldn't just be an exile. The people would be instantly totally vaporized.
Oh, wow. I never thought of it like that. So God leaves the building, so he doesn't have to obliterate the people.
Yes. By withdrawing his presence, the temple is just an empty stone box. It loses its divine protection, which allows the Babylonians to destroy the physical structure, sure, but it prevents the complete annihilation of the ethnic lineage of Israel.
God is clearing the ground. He is allowing the judgment to fall on the structure so he can spare a remnant.
It's a controlled demolition.
He's removing the false security of the brick-and-mortar temple so that eventually he can build a new temple, one made out of people, what the New Testament calls living stones.
That is the exact trajectory. And God explicitly says he does this for his name's sake. He doesn't spare the remnant because they were good people. He spares them to protect his own reputation among the nations, to prove that he is a God who keeps his ancient promises to Abraham, even when the children of Abraham are completely faithless.
Okay, so the city falls, the temple burns. Zion theology is officially dead. And this creates an immediate, massive crisis on the ground for the exiles in Babylon.
A crisis of leadership.
Exactly, because all of their leaders, the kings from the line of David, the high priests, the royal advisors, they have all been exposed as frauds, or they've been killed, or they've been blinded and imprisoned by the Babylonians.
There is a total power vacuum.
Right. Who is going to lead this traumatized remnant?
This is where the book makes its major pivot. We hit chapter 34, which is the beginning of the ministry of construction.
Finally, we get to build something.
Right. God steps into this leadership vacuum, and he starts by issuing a blistering indictment against the old regime. He calls them the false shepherds of Israel.
The source paper uses a really great phrase for this. It calls it the sociology of predation. Break down what these false shepherds were actually doing.
Well, in the ancient Near East, the king was always referred to as the shepherd of his people. His primary duty was to protect the flock and ensure they were fed.
Make sure they're safe from wolves, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But God looks at the kings of Judah and says, "You didn't feed the flock. You ate the fat. You clothed yourselves with the wool. You slaughtered the fat sheep, but you did not feed the sheep."
They treated the citizens as a resource to be consumed for their own luxury, rather than a vulnerable group to be protected.
Yes, they ignored the sick. They didn't bind up the injured. They didn't go looking for the strays. They ruled with force and harshness.
Which is just awful leadership.
And because the shepherds were corrupt, the flock was scattered and became prey for all the wild beasts, meaning the surrounding empires.
So what does God do about it?
God effectively fires the entire political establishment. He deposes the Davidic dynasty in its current corrupt form. And he makes a staggering unilateral declaration. He says, "Behold, I myself will search for my sheep and will seek them out."
Which is an incredibly comforting promise. God is taking over the management. He's basically saying, if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself.
Exactly.
But as I'm reading through this section of the paper, I hit a massive theological wall. Let me read you the progression here because it's confusing.
Go for it.
In verse 11, God says, "I myself will be the shepherd." In verse 15, "I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep." But then, just a few verses later, in verse 23, God says, "And I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David shall be prince among them."
Yep.
Okay, hold on. You can't have it both ways. How can Yahweh be the sole, exclusive shepherd and in the exact same breath promise that a human king from the line of David is going to be the sole shepherd? It seems like a blatant contradiction. Is it God or is it a man?
This is one of the most brilliant intentional tensions in all of biblical prophecy. The author of the paper calls it the messianic paradox.
Okay, messianic paradox. So it's supposed to be a puzzle.
Exactly. If you are an ancient Israelite reading this in the 6th century BC, it is an unsolvable riddle. You have a locked door with two distinct keyholes, and you have no idea what kind of key could possibly fit into both at the same time.
Right, because you know God has to be the savior, because humans keep failing. But you also know God made an unbreakable covenant with King David that a human descendant would sit on the throne forever.
Exactly. So how does the redemptive historical blueprint solve this? It sets the perfect theological substrate for the incarnation.
Ah, Jesus.
Fast forward 600 years to the Gospel of John, chapter 10. Jesus is standing in Jerusalem talking to the religious leaders, who are essentially the new generation of false shepherds, and he makes one of his most famous I am statements. He says, I am the good shepherd.
Oh, wow. He isn't just using a nice pastoral metaphor there, is he?
Not at all. He is actively claiming to be the fulfillment of Ezekiel 34.
He is claiming to be the key that turns both locks simultaneously.
Yes. By saying, I am the good shepherd, Jesus is making a dual claim. He's claiming to be the human Davidic descendant promised by the covenant. And because he is using the divine I am, he is claiming to be Yahweh himself, stepping into history in flesh and blood to personally rescue his flock.
He is the God-man solution to the messianic paradox.
Precisely.
That completely blows my mind. The Old Testament creates the puzzle, and the New Testament is the only piece that fits the shape. But Jesus also pushes the Ezekiel prophecy even further, doesn't he? Ezekiel says the shepherd will rescue the sheep and feed them, but Jesus says the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep.
Yes. The divine shepherd doesn't just fight the wolves. He lets the wolves tear him apart to satisfy the justice required for the sheep's rebellion.
And I want to touch on who exactly these wolves are for a second, because when we think of a rescue operation in exile, we assume salvation just means being saved from the Babylonians, the big, bad, external empire.
Right.
But the source text highlights a concept in Ezekiel 34 called internal judgment.
This is a vital nuance. God says, I will judge between sheep and sheep, between rams and male goats. He specifically targets the fat sheep within the flock.
Who are the fat sheep?
They are the wealthy, the powerful, the bullies within the Israelite community itself. God accuses them of eating the best pasture and then trampling down the rest with their feet so the weak sheep can't eat.
They drink the clear water and then muddy the rest with their hooves.
Exactly. It's economic and social exploitation right inside the community of faith.
So the gospel, according to Ezekiel, is deeply concerned with societal justice. Salvation isn't just about escaping a foreign superpower. It's about God directly intervening to protect the marginalized, the weak, and the poor from being exploited by their own brothers.
He promises to destroy the fat and the strong and feed them with judgment.
You can draw a direct, straight line from that internal judgment to the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament. I mean, think of Mary's Magnificat in the Gospel of Luke. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty.
Or the Beatitudes. The gospel always carries this preferential care for the marginalized.
And the ultimate result of this new, perfect shepherding is what Ezekiel calls a covenant of peace.
Yes, a comprehensive vision of shalom.
What does that look like?
It means ecological harmony, where the wild beasts are banished, the rains come in their season, the trees yield their fruit, and fundamentally, the people live in total security knowing that the Lord is with them.
Okay, I love the vision of the covenant of peace. I love the idea of the perfect shepherd. But if I'm in exile listening to Ezekiel preach this, I have a massive, glaring, logical objection.
What's the objection? Let's hear it.
You can give a flock the absolute best, most perfect divine shepherd in the universe. But if the sheep themselves are still fundamentally broken, if they still have those hearts of stone that caused the exile in the first place, they're just going to wander off, rebel, and play the harlot all over again.
Right. A new leader doesn't solve the problem if the citizens are still deeply corrupt.
Exactly.
That is the exact tension that drives the narrative forward. A new environment and a new leader are utterly insufficient without a fundamentally new nature. The people themselves have to be reconstructed from the inside out.
Which leads us to the absolute core of this theological blueprint, Ezekiel 36 and 37.
The heart transplant.
Yes. And before we get into the mechanics of how God changes their nature, we really have to talk about why he does it. The source paper hammers hard on the doctrine of sola gratia, grace alone.
It is unavoidable in the text. God is ruthlessly clear about his motivations. He says, "It is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations."
That's almost insulting. I'm not saving you because you're awesome. I'm saving you to clear my own name.
It absolutely destroys human pride. But, ironically, it is the ultimate bedrock of security.
How so?
Think about it. If God saves you because of your good behavior, then the moment your behavior slips, you lose your salvation.
True.
But if God's salvation is entirely rooted in vindicating his own eternal character and promises, then your salvation is as secure as God's character.
So it doesn't depend on you at all?
Not at all. He cannot leave them in exile forever because the surrounding nations will look at it and conclude that Yahweh is a weak, impotent God who couldn't protect his own people. But he also cannot just bring them back to the land with their hearts of stone, because that would mean he tolerates sin and idolatry, which violates his holiness.
So God is in a divine bind of his own perfection. He must bring them back to vindicate his power, but he must make them holy to vindicate his righteousness.
Therefore, the only logical solution is a supernatural overhaul of human nature. He says, I will bring them back, but I have to fundamentally alter who they are so they actually want to obey me.
And Ezekiel 36 lays out exactly how this happens. It gives us what theologians call the ordo salutis.
The order of salvation. It is a step-by-step breakdown of the mechanics of the new covenant.
Let's walk through these steps, because this is where the gospel really comes into focus. Step 1 is purification.
God says, I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleannesses, and from all your idols I will cleanse you.
To an ancient Israelite, that immediately evokes the ritual washing required by the Levitical law, right? Like after coming into contact with a corpse or a leper.
Exactly. It is the doctrine of justification. God is sovereignly removing the guilt, the stain, and the objective reality of their sin.
He's scrubbing the record clean.
Yes.
But a clean record doesn't stop you from sinning tomorrow. So step 2 is transformation, the radical surgery.
And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh.
We've established that the stony heart is dead, calcified, and incapable of spiritual life. God doesn't prescribe physical therapy for the stone heart.
No, he doesn't say, try harder to be soft.
Right. He performs an absolute, total extraction. He removes it and inserts a heart of flesh, meaning a heart that is alive, beating, pliable, and capable of responding to the love of God.
Exactly.
I think about it like this. Imagine you have a student who is failing a class.
Okay.
If the problem is just ignorance, you get them a better textbook or a stricter tutor. But if you walk into the classroom and the student is a literal corpse slumped over the desk, a new textbook is utterly useless.
Very true.
The problem isn't a lack of information. The problem is a lack of biological life. You have to resurrect the student before you can teach them anything.
That is the perfect analogy for the doctrine of regeneration. The law of Moses was the textbook, and it failed because the students were spiritually dead.
Which brings us to step 3, indwelling.
Yes. God says, and I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules.
Notice the transition there from the external to the internal. The Old Covenant featured the law written on stone tablets, stored in a stone box, housed in a stone temple completely outside of the person.
Right, but the new covenant takes the Spirit of God, the Ruach, and places it directly inside the human chest cavity.
And I love the phrase, cause you to walk. The Holy Spirit becomes the efficient cause of their obedience. They don't obey to get a new heart. They obey because the new heart and the indwelling spirit empower them to do so. It's an entirely new operating system.
It really is. And this exact sequence, water, new heart, new spirit, is the exact theological framework Jesus assumes every Jewish leader should know.
This is the background to that famous late-night conversation in John chapter 3, isn't it?
Yes. Nicodemus. He's a Pharisee, a prominent religious teacher, a guy who has memorized the Old Testament, and he comes to Jesus and says, we know you're a teacher come from God.
And Jesus essentially ignores the compliment and hits him with, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God.
Nicodemus is deeply confused by this.
Yeah.
He takes it literally. How can a man enter his mother's womb a second time?
Which is a fair question if you're thinking biologically.
True. But Jesus responds by explicitly quoting Ezekiel 36. He says, Unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. And then Jesus actually rebukes him. He says, are you the teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things?
Jesus is saying, Nicodemus, you have memorized Ezekiel. You should know that entering the kingdom isn't about your ethnic birthline or how strictly you keep the external rules of the Pharisees. The prophets already told you that you need a supernatural regeneration. You need the water and the Spirit. You need the heart transplant.
Nicodemus was trying to renovate the house, and Jesus told him he needed a demolition and a completely new foundation.
Now, to make absolutely sure the exiles understand the sheer impossibility and the total dependency of this process, God gives Ezekiel a visual dramatization of this regeneration in chapter 37.
Easily the most famous passage in the book, the Valley of Dry Bones.
It is a stunning, cinematic, and profoundly disturbing vision. The Spirit carries Ezekiel out and sets him down in the middle of a valley full of human bones.
Let's talk about the cultural weight of this for a second.
Okay.
To an ancient Israelite, an unburied corpse was a curse. It meant you were defeated, abandoned, and cut off from your ancestors. A valley full of thousands of unburied skeletons is the aftermath of an absolute massacre. It is a monument to total defeat.
And the text goes out of its way to emphasize a specific detail here. It says, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and behold, they were very dry.
They aren't just recently deceased. There is no residual moisture, no connective tissue, no DNA left to clone. They have been bleaching in the Babylonian sun for years. They are completely, utterly past the point of resuscitation.
It is the ultimate visual representation of total depravity and spiritual death. It is Israel's state in exile, and it is humanity's state in sin.
God walks Ezekiel around the valley, forcing him to take in the sheer scale of the hopelessness. And then God asks him a question that feels like a cruel joke. He asks, Son of man, can these bones live?
I love Ezekiel's answer here. He's learned his lesson. He's not going to say no because he knows God is powerful, but he's not going to say yes because he's looking at literal dust. So he punts. He says, oh, Lord God, you know.
It's the only safe answer. So God tells Ezekiel how this impossible resurrection is going to happen. He says, prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord.
He commands him to preach to inanimate calcium. I mean, if you've ever felt like your words are falling on deaf ears, imagine preaching a sermon to a skeleton.
But this highlights the fundamental methodology of God's redemptive work. It is the power of the Word of God to create life ex nihilo out of nothing. Just as God spoke the cosmos into existence in Genesis 1, he commands the prophet to speak the Word to create new spiritual life.
But what's fascinating is that the resurrection doesn't happen all at once, does it? It happens in two distinct stages, which perfectly mirrors that Ordo Salutis we just discussed.
Right. Stage 1 is the physical reconstruction. Ezekiel prophesies, and there is a rattling sound. It's a terrifying noise. Thousands of bones snapping together, joining at the joints. Sinews appear, flesh grows over them, and skin covers them. But the text adds a chilling caveat. But there was no breath in them.
So now instead of a valley of bones, you have a valley of perfect, fleshy corpses, which raises a question. Why the two stages? If God is omnipotent, why not just zap them alive instantly?
The two stages are a brilliant theological diagnostic tool. The reconstructed corpses represented people who might have outward structural conformity. Maybe they even physically returned to the land of Israel, but they are still completely devoid of spiritual life.
It warns us that external religious structure without the internal power of God is just a well-organized graveyard.
Exactly. You can have the theology right, you can have the rituals right, you can have all the bones in the correct anatomical position. But without the breath, you are dead.
Which necessitates stage 2. God says, prophesy to the breath, prophesy, Son of Man, and say to the breath, thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe on these slain that they may live.
And the word for breath there is ruach, the exact same word used for spirit and wind. The breath enters them, and they come alive and stand on their feet. An exceedingly great army.
The Spirit is the animating force of the new creation, and we really cannot read this without fast-forwarding to the book of Acts.
Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost.
Exactly. The disciples are gathered in a room in Jerusalem. They are basically a pile of dry bones right now. They are terrified, confused, hiding from the authorities. And what happens? A sound like a mighty rushing wind, the Ruach fills the entire house.
The Spirit of God enters them. Peter, filled with the Spirit, stands up and prophesies. He preaches the word of God to a crowd of spiritually dead people. And 3,000 souls are pierced to the heart and brought to life in a single day.
The early Christian church is literally the fulfillment of the Valley of Dry Bones. It is a community of dead sinners who were reconstructed by the word and animated entirely by the breath of Pentecost.
The gospel, according to Ezekiel, makes it crystal clear. The church only exists, and a believer only has life because of the animating breath of God.
Okay, so following this massive redemptive blueprint, we now have an army of living, breathing people. They have new hearts of flesh, and they have the Holy Spirit inside them. But there is a massive historical problem lingering in the background here.
What's that?
Well, if I look around this valley of resurrected people and I realize I am standing shoulder to shoulder with a guy that my ancestors have been in a bitter, bloody civil war with for 300 years, just breathing isn't enough. We are going to kill each other.
Yes, the division.
Right. How does Ezekiel's gospel address the deep, entrenched hatred between God's own people?
This is a brilliant transition because it proves that the gospel is not just about individual personal salvation. It is inherently about corporate reconciliation. The new heart has to manifest in new community.
And God gives Ezekiel another physical sign act to demonstrate this in the second half of chapter 37, the sign of the two sticks.
Right. Ezekiel's told to take one piece of wood and write on it for Judah, representing the southern kingdom. Then he takes another piece of wood and writes on it for Joseph or Ephraim, representing the northern kingdom.
To feel the weight of this, you really have to remember the history. After King Solomon died in 931 BC, the nation of Israel tore itself in half in a brutal civil war.
The 10 northern tribes broke away from the Davidic throne in Jerusalem. They set up rival worship centers with golden calves. They hated each other. They fought border wars for centuries.
Eventually, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC, and those 10 tribes were deported, scattered, and largely considered lost to the sands of history.
They were historically estranged. The hostility was baked into their DNA for generations.
And God tells Ezekiel to take these two sticks, representing these two violently opposed factions, and join them together in his hand so that they become one single stick.
And God explains the symbolism. He says, I will take the people of Israel from the nations, and I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them all, and they shall be no longer two nations and no longer divided into two kingdoms.
He is promising to eschatologically reverse hundreds of years of sinful fragmentation. He is gathering the lost tribes and grafting them back into a single, unified people under the sole rulership of the new Davidic shepherd.
And if we look at the New Testament, the Apostle Paul essentially writes a direct, sweeping theological commentary on this exact concept in his letter to the Ephesians, specifically Ephesians chapter 2.
Oh, absolutely. Paul is dealing with an even wider, more deeply entrenched hostility, the divide between Jews and Gentiles.
For centuries, the Jews viewed the Gentiles as unclean, outside the covenant, basically fuel for the fires of hell. And the Gentiles viewed the Jews as weird, arrogant isolationists.
But Paul says that Christ, in his flesh, has broken down the dividing wall of hostility.
Exactly. Just as Ezekiel saw the northern and southern kingdoms becoming one stick in the hand of God, Paul says that Christ's purpose on the cross was to create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, thereby killing the hostility.
The absolute mystery of the gospel is that the inclusion of the Gentiles into the church is the ultimate cosmic fulfillment of those scattered lost tribes being gathered back in. The Gentiles are grafted into the singular olive tree of true Israel. We are all made one stick in the hand of the Son of David.
And this unified community is finally ready to experience the fullness of the covenant of peace. God promises, my dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. It is the restoration of Edenic harmony.
But just when you think the story is wrapping up with a nice bow, the narrative takes a violent, jarring left turn.
It really does.
Right after this beautiful promise of everlasting peace, we hit chapters 38 and 39. And suddenly we are reading about a massive, terrifying, apocalyptic invasion by a figure named Gog of the land of Magog. I have to ask, if God just instituted a permanent, eternal covenant of peace, why is there suddenly an epic war?
It feels like a massive contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But the source paper argues that this invasion is actually the critical final step in proving the validity of the gospel. The author calls this section the gospel of victory.
Explain that. How is an invasion part of the gospel?
Think about human nature and anxiety. If you are an exile who has just been restored to your land, you are suffering from severe geopolitical PTSD. You are constantly looking over your shoulder. You know that Babylon or Assyria or Egypt could march over the horizon at any moment and destroy everything again.
Because they've done it before.
Exactly. A salvation that can be easily lost to the very next invading army isn't a true salvation. A peace that can be shattered by a stronger enemy isn't a true covenant of peace.
Uh, so God has to prove that this time the security is permanent. He has to demonstrate eternal security.
Right. So Gog of Magog represents the archetypal ultimate enemy. He's the amalgamation of every evil, chaotic force arrayed against the people of God. He gathers a massive coalition of nations from the uttermost parts of the north, and he marches down to plunder the peaceful, restored villages of Israel.
But the text reveals something shocking about the mechanics of this invasion. Gog thinks he is executing a brilliant military strategy to steal gold and silver, but God says, I will turn you about and put hooks into your jaws and I will bring you out. God is actively orchestrating the attack.
God is picking the fight. He is baiting the ultimate enemy out of hiding, drawing all the forces of evil into one place, not to let Israel be destroyed, but to definitively, finally, and cosmically eradicate evil from the universe.
And the battle itself is completely asymmetrical. That great army of resurrected dry bones. They don't even draw a sword. They don't fight.
They don't have to.
Yeah.
God defeats Gog through sheer, overwhelming cosmic intervention. He sends earthquakes, torrential rains, hailstones, fire, and sulfur. It is a direct callback to the plagues of Egypt and the destruction of Sodom.
It proves to the listener that their security is 100% dependent on God's power, not their own military prowess.
And the aftermath of the battle highlights the absolute totality of the victory. Ezekiel uses deeply symbolic, hyperbolic numbers to describe the cleanup. The people spend 7 months burying the dead bodies of the enemies to cleanse the land. And they spend 7 years burning the discarded weapons of Gog's army for firewood.
7 being the biblical number of divine completion and perfection.
Precisely. It is a promise that when God finally restores his people and defeats evil, the victory will be total, complete, and eternally secure. You will never have to look over your shoulder again.
This is why the Book of Revelation, in chapter 20, uses this exact imagery of Gog and Magog to describe the final, failed rebellion of Satan at the very end of human history, right before the inauguration of the new heavens and the new earth.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the grand finale of Ezekiel's blueprint. With the enemies permanently vanquished, the people regenerated, the spirit indwelling, and the tribes united, Ezekiel spends the final 9 chapters of his book, chapters 40 through 48, describing a massive, highly detailed architectural vision of a new temple.
The paper calls this final section the Gospel of Consummation. It is a vision of the cosmos completely and perfectly ordered by the holiness of God.
Yes.
But okay, I have to push back hard here. I have to raise a major red flag because these final chapters create a massive interpretive nightmare for Christians.
It is the most debated section of the book, without a doubt.
Because in this vision of the new temple, Ezekiel clearly, explicitly describes literal animal sacrifices taking place. He talks about altars, blood being sprinkled, and a figure called the prince offering sin offerings for himself and the people.
Right.
But the book of Hebrews in the New Testament is absolutely, unequivocally explicit. Jesus Christ was the final, once-for-all sacrifice for sin. Hebrews says it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. If Ezekiel is supposed to be a blueprint for the New Testament gospel, doesn't this vision completely contradict the core of Christianity? Are we supposed to go back to slitting the throats of sheep?
That is the exact question scholars have wrestled with for centuries. Some theological camps take a strictly literal, futurist approach. They argue that in a future millennial kingdom, a physical temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem, and animal sacrifices will be reinstituted as a kind of memorial to Christ's death, similar to how communion looks back at the cross.
That feels like a massive step backward, going from the reality of the cross back to the shadow of animals.
Many theologians agree with your hesitation. And if we look at this through the redemptive-historical lens that this paper uses, there is a much more profound, cohesive solution. The author solves this dilemma using the concept of prophetic idiom.
Prophetic idiom. I need you to explain that, because right now it sounds like a convenient loophole to ignore the parts of the text we don't like.
It's not a loophole. It's an acknowledgement of how human language works. Prophetic idiom means we have to consider the vocabulary and the conceptual framework available to the prophet receiving the vision. Think about who Ezekiel is. He is a 6th century BC Levitical priest. His entire conceptual universe of holiness, access to God, and forgiveness is built on the architecture of the temple and the sacrificial system.
Right, he doesn't know about the cross, the empty tomb, or the Roman Empire yet.
Exactly. So when God gives Ezekiel a vision of the ultimate, perfect, eschatological reality of Christ's final atonement, The absolute perfection of the new covenant Ezekiel has to describe that reality using the only vocabulary he possesses. He doesn't have the theological vocabulary of the book of Hebrews. He only has the vocabulary of altars, bulls, and goats.
The source papers use a brilliant analogy for this. It says, imagine if an ancient prophet was given a vision of modern space travel, a Saturn V rocket launching into orbit. The prophet wouldn't write down, I saw a multi-stage liquid-fueled rocket utilizing thrust vector control. He doesn't have those words.
No, he doesn't.
He would write down, I saw a chariot of fire mounting up with wings like giant eagles, roaring with the voice of 1,000 thunders. He's describing a real future event, but he's translating it into the idiom of his own day.
That is precisely what Ezekiel is doing. He is describing the finality of atonement, the perfect maintenance of holiness, and the permanent access to God using the language of an ancient temple. The substance of the vision is that the barrier between God and humanity is forever removed. A reality we know from the New Testament is accomplished solely by the blood of Christ.
Okay, but let me challenge that. If it's just a metaphor, if it's just an idiom, why does he spend chapters giving exact, precise cubit measurements for the doors, the walls, and the courtyards? You don't take a tape measure to a metaphor.
Actually, in the ancient Near East, you do. We have ancient Babylonian and Sumerian texts, like the cylinders of Gudea-Lagash, where kings received divine temple blueprints in dreams with exact measurements. But the purpose of those measurements wasn't necessarily to hand them to a general contractor to start pouring concrete.
What was the purpose then?
The extreme precision and symmetry of the measurements symbolize divine order, perfection, and cosmic harmony. By giving these hyper-detailed measurements, Ezekiel is communicating that God's future salvation will be perfectly ordered, perfectly holy, and meticulously designed.
And the text gives us a massive clue that this isn't meant to be read as a literal prediction of Jesus offering animals. You mentioned the prince in Ezekiel's vision earlier.
Yes, the prince is required to offer a sin offering for his own sins.
Which conclusively proves the prince cannot be Jesus. Hebrews 4 says Jesus was without sin. He didn't need to offer a sacrifice for himself.
Exactly. The prince is a figurehead, part of the prophetic idiom, highlighting the need for a perfect administrative head of the people, a role that only the sinless God-man could eventually fulfill.
Okay, that significantly clears up the theological hurdle, and it allows us to appreciate the beauty of the vision without getting bogged down in the blueprints. Because amidst all these architectural measurements, there is a stunning, dynamic piece of imagery in chapter 47, the river of life.
It is one of the most potent, beautiful gospel images in the entire Old Testament. Ezekiel sees a tiny trickle of water flowing out from under the threshold of this new temple, flowing toward the east.
And an angel with a measuring line wades into the water with Ezekiel. He measures out 1,000 cubits, and the water is ankle deep. He measures another 1,000, and it's knee deep. Another 1,000, it's waist deep, until finally it is a massive raging river that cannot be crossed.
Notice the physics of this river. It defies natural law. A normal river gets deeper and wider because other tributaries and streams flow into it. But this river has no tributaries. It grows through miraculous, exponential multiplication.
It's a vivid metaphor for the expanding nature of God's grace and his kingdom. It starts small, a baby in a manger, 12 guys in a boat, but it becomes an overwhelming, unstoppable cosmic force.
And we have to look at the geography of where this river flows. It flows eastward, down into the Arabah, which is the Jordan Rift Valley, and it empties straight into the Dead Sea.
The Dead Sea. Let's talk about the biological reality of that body of water. It is the lowest point on the surface of the Earth. The salinity is around 34%. It is nearly 10 times saltier than the ocean. It is a toxic, hypersaline environment where macroscopic aquatic life is impossible. It is the literal definition of a dead zone.
And Ezekiel says that when the river from the temple hits the Dead Sea, the toxic, salty water is completely healed and turns fresh. Swarms of living creatures start thriving. Fishermen stand on the shores casting nets because the fish are as abundant as the Great Sea, the Mediterranean.
Think about the theological weight of that for a second. The river of God's grace doesn't just flow into nice, pristine environments. It flows into the lowest, most barren, most toxic, dead environments of the human soul and the darkest corners of human society. And it brings absolute abundant life. Where the river goes, everything lives.
And on the banks of this river, Ezekiel sees trees growing. They bear fresh fruit every single month because the water flowing to them comes from the sanctuary. And the text says, their fruit will be for food and their leaves for healing.
If you are a Christian reading this, alarms should be going off in your head because we see this exact specific imagery reappear at the very end of the Bible.
Revelation chapter 22, the final chapter of the biblical canon.
Yeah.
John the Apostle sees the New Jerusalem, and he says, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal. On either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations."
John is explicitly borrowing Ezekiel's vision to describe the eternal state. But there is one massive paradigm-shifting difference between Ezekiel's vision and John's vision.
What's the difference?
In Ezekiel, the river flows from the physical structure of the temple building. But in Revelation 21 and 22, John looks around the New Jerusalem and he explicitly notes that there is no temple in the city. He writes, "For its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb." Ezekiel sees the source of life as a building. John has the full revelation, and he sees the source of life as a person, Jesus Christ, the Lamb.
It all points to Jesus. He is the true temple from which the living water flows. Which brings us to the very last sentence, the very last phrase of the entire book of Ezekiel. After 48 chapters of brutal demolition, bizarre chariot visions, bloody infants, dry bones, apocalyptic wars, and architectural measurements, the entire epic concludes with the naming of the city.
YHWH Shema.
The Lord is there.
It is the perfect poetic bookend to the entire crisis.
It truly is. Remember where this nightmare started. It began back in chapters 8 through 11 with Ichabod. The glory of the Lord departing the temple because of human sin and idolatry. The presence of God was lost. The entire redemptive arc of the book, the demolition of false security, the provision of the new Davidic shepherd, the surgical transplant of the new heart, the animating breath of the Spirit, the reconciliation of the two sticks, the permanent victory over Gog. It is all a highly coordinated divine operation aimed at one singular goal: resolving the Ichabod.
Getting the presence of God back to the people.
The ultimate goal of the gospel isn't just getting a get-out-of-hell-free card. It's not just behavioral modification so you act like a nice citizen. It is the permanent, unmediated restoration of the presence of God with humanity. YHWH Shema.
It points directly to the promise of the incarnation Emmanuel, God with us, and it perfectly anticipates the final victorious cry of Revelation 21. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man.
So, synthesizing this massive journey, what does the gospel according to Ezekiel ultimately teach us? It teaches us that true salvation is radically God-centered. It requires a supernatural heart transplant. It bridges the Old and New Testaments, proving that the Bible is one unified, cohesive story of redemption. And it demonstrates the incredible power of God to enter the graveyard of human history and reverse the irreversible.
It is a robust, gritty theology of hope. It doesn't shy away from the horrific reality of our sin. It doesn't offer cheap grace or quick fixes. It presents a God who willingly gets his hands dirty to breathe his own life into our dust. And as we wrap up this deep dive, there is a final thought I want to leave you with, something that builds on this idea of the temple and the river of life.
Let's hear it.
We spent all this time talking about how God dismantled the physical, brick-and-mortar Zion theology of the Old Testament. He destroyed the building to save the people. And then the New Testament reveals that we, the believers, are the new living stones. We are the temple. The Holy Spirit resides in our chests, and the river of life is meant to flow out from us into the dead seas of our communities. So here's the provocative question. Why do we spend so much time and billions of dollars trying to reconstruct modern, physical Zion theologies? We build massive, state-of-the-art megachurch buildings with perfect acoustics, coffee shops, and fog machines, and we subtly tie the presence of God to those specific locations. Are we accidentally trying to rebuild the very thing Ezekiel spent 48 chapters tearing down? What would happen if we truly believed that the uncrossable river of God's healing grace isn't supposed to flow out of a multi-million-dollar sanctuary, but is supposed to flow out of you, right where you are, in the mundane dirt of your everyday life?
That is a deeply challenging application of Ezekiel's message. It forces us to ask where we are truly locating our hope in God's presence.
It really does. It challenges us to stop trusting in the buildings and start trusting in the breath. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today.